Thanks so much, TJ. Yeah, it's a real privilege to be here and chat to you all again. Very much looking forward to finishing off this series. Um, what I'm going to introduce today is a bit of a brain dump of the ways that I've seen people work in sort of diverse and slightly alternative ways when doing systematic reviews and systematic maps. Um, and the ways that when I've been mentoring and working with people, we've tried, and on my own projects, to engineer the methodology in a way that sort of compensates for the diversity in the reasons that we're doing the reviews, the complexity of the evidence base, um, and tries to adapt the methodology to best suit what we want out of it and what we can do with the with the resources that we have at our disposal. So that's what I'll be introducing. I'll start off by talking about what I mean when I talk about standard reviews. I guess in a sort of ideal scenario, historically speaking, this would be what people would think a systematic review was. Um, we'll then spend some time thinking about what makes a review non-standard and how that differs across different fields, perhaps. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about nomenclature. So, what do you call your reviews when they're non-standard? But primarily thinking about what really matters. Is it the labeling and the naming, or actually what you do and what you say you've done? I'll then run through a small number of case studies that align with different types of non-standard reviews that I've experienced, that I've come across. And we'll give some case studies to illustrate how we've tackled those topics. And then finish on a concept that I call finishability, which is always a big fear with the systematic reviews that I've been involved with, is trying to finish on time with the resources available. So I'll talk specifically about the practice that we've developed in our reviews to minimize risk and maximize chances of finishing. So what do I mean when I say a standard review? Well, this would be one that some of you on the call might be really familiar with, depending on your field, but you'd have a modest evidence base, so not massive. You'd probably be dealing with a topic that is relatively coherent from a terminology perspective. They might have one way of saying something or just a couple of synonyms for the same concept. The studies that you'd be bringing together would all be pretty similar. They'd be down the end of the mode of synthesis called aggregative synthesis, where you're asking questions about summary effect and you're interested in the overall effect primarily. And so you're wanting to combine very similar studies together. The opposite end is configurative synthesis, which we'll discuss in a bit, but it's more interested in complexity and diversity. So standard reviews have historically primarily just been focused on aggregating similar studies. Probably in these kind of reviews, you'd have one or maybe two very similar study designs. And as a result, if you're doing critical appraisal study validity, you'd have one sort of off-the-shelf critical appraisal tool that's, for example, bespoke, designed for randomized control trials and has been used and tried and tested. You'd probably be doing synthesis using quantitative metrics. You might even be using raw mean difference if all of your studies use the same study units. And this context, this scenario, is really common in healthcare. And it means that their reviews are pretty standard and can be conducted more easily than in other topics. And that's because in healthcare, they have lots of research evidence. So you can still be very narrow and focused in your question and have a moderate number of studies. Also in healthcare, this is quite a key point. Policies in healthcare are quite narrow. So because the way that information feeds through guidelines into practice, policies are made at a very narrow field of scope. So reductionism in complexity makes sense because you can ask a question about a very specific population, a single outcome, a specific comparator, and a single intervention, and still get enough studies to aggregate them and find an effect that makes a decision about the use of that intervention helpful. Also in healthcare, there are generally there's standards that mean the type of methods used and the reporting of those methods in primary studies are pretty standardized. So not only are the studies all looking at the same thing, they're all reported in a pretty similar way. And so one example is this review that was looking at comparing surgery versus radiotherapy for muscle invasive bladder cancer. And they only had 571 search results and 3 eligible studies. That's sort of what I mean at the extreme end of a standard study. It's quantitative, it's very specific, has a modest set of search results and a small evidence base. And these sort of fit in the landscape of review methodologies as the red text here. They are primarily quantitative syntheses or referred to as meta-analyses in some fields. They are reviews that synthesize the findings of studies. They sit alongside more complex, more recent additions to the evidence synthesis methodology toolkit, like qualitative synthesis. They can be adjacent to rapid reviews, which are reviews that synthesize findings but cut corners. And these reviews are compared to other types of reviews at the bottom of the screen where we're talking about what the nature of the evidence base is. So these are things like scoping reviews or other types of more rigorous maps, like evidence maps, systematic maps, evidence and gap maps, they're sometimes referred to. So the standard reviews are the quantitative, modest syntheses that we just talked about. The non-standard reviews are sort of everything else. And when you start looking at the non-standard methodologies and how they're referred to in the literature, this is a set of search results in Lens. This is where the reviews sit by field. So you can see a huge number of systematic reviews that are primarily conducted in healthcare. If you look at systematic maps, they're more of a recent methodology that developed in the field of social science and ecology and environmental science in particular, but there's far fewer of them. And then evidence and gap maps, which is a very specific type of evidence map, are even less common and really distributed across quite a few fields. But again, healthcare dominating there, which is quite interesting because this did, as a methodology, develop in social science. So there are reasons, as I've implied already, that a lot of real world projects, particularly outside of the field of healthcare, don't fit this mold of being a standard systematic review. And that means we might really want to think carefully about using slightly different methodology and project planning. It might be that we have particular funding or time constraints. That's a really common one. It might be that there's a particular policy urgency, and that in the field of health, because systematic reviews are integrated into policy making in a very long-term way. In other fields, often if there is a policy need, you get approached maybe 6 weeks before they need a decision, and they say they needed the systematic review yesterday. So the kind of time frame that you're doing systematic reviews over is much shorter, or evidence synthesis is much shorter, because there's generally not a great cyclical mode of planning in terms of the needs of evidence syntheses. You do see with certain things like the Common Agricultural Policy, which updates every 7 years, people are able to predict when evidence synthesis would be needed. But often people come with a need for evidence that is quite urgent. And so the idea of doing a systematic review slowly over a couple of years really might not fit. Also, contrary to healthcare, a lot of other fields have policy that is not very narrow and focused. So the policy need is quite broad. The need might be about a whole suite of interventions, which one works best, or which outcomes are best for measuring a certain metric, but they probably won't be very specific in terms of their population either. And so reducing the complexity of a systematic review down to a very narrow scope might not then align with the policy need. Also, sort of related to that, often the questions that get asked are very interdisciplinary. They often are a suite of questions collected together that mean it's not just a question of does this work, and if so, by how much. It's actually looking at a lot more nuance, looking at the factors that affect how something works, how a system functions. And that's getting into the configurative stuff that I mentioned earlier. Often there's quite a spread out evidence base in other fields, or it might be that the field is quite new. It might be that actually we have interests other than what are the impacts of a particular intervention or effectiveness of an intervention. And it might be that we're actually really interested in what the nature is of a very broad evidence base. So perhaps an entire field or a relatively new field. It might be that we're particularly interested in how the academic literature has framed a concept or what definitions are being used to understand a system. It might be that we're interested in what methods are being used and assessing the quality of those methods and their ability to drive policymaking or decision making or their causal inference, for example. So what I've seen happening is often when you get these non-standard review questions, what often happens is that should have said same, sorry, not tame. But what often happens is that there is a rapid form of review that tries to deal with all of these constraints or different ideas of what they want by cutting corners to get to the same destination. Whereas what I think is really interesting, the most interesting component of question formulation and developing the right methodology to answer that question is thinking about adapting the methods you use to do a systematic review, whatever type that is. And that is akin to changing the destination or changing the mode of transport. And so rather than feeling constrained by having to do a traditional style systematic review and not quite being able to do it as well as we'd want, you can adapt the methodology in ways where we know there won't be a key bias or limitation that slips in because of it, and allows us to really learn from systematic review methodology, but be efficient in the way that we do it slightly differently. So the kinds of things that make a review non-standard are where we might want to do a map of the evidence, see what have people studied in the literature, but also do some form of additional analysis. And that might be that we want to do a thematic analysis to build a framework to understand how academia has viewed a topic or tackled a problem. It might be that we want a map of the evidence base that also produced a long list of barriers and facilitators. Or it might be that we would use mapping to look at some other form of knowledge systems. So rather than just academic literature, we could be looking at practitioner knowledge or business knowledge or indigenous and local knowledge in ways that has not been documented in academic literature, but might be in documents of some kind for which systematic review style methods could be adapted. It might also be that we are, as I mentioned before, more interested in the diversity, not just what does it say, but how is the system affected by all these other covariates. And so this is where we've got a different output destination. We're not perhaps trying to do the same thing as a systematic review when we can adapt our methods appropriately. Then we might have resource constraints like very large evidence bases or limited resources, but we also might be particularly interested in mapping the evidence base and saying what does this evidence base look like rather than what does it say in terms of study findings. And then we might also have topics which I really, really hate, but which are very common, which are semantically cohesive, meaning they are all related conceptually, but terminologically disparate, disconnected, which means they are all on the same thing, but they all use different words to describe it. These are also called diffuse concepts. And so this is where the topic is constraining the type of methodology. And if we were to do a traditional systematic review relying on searching bibliographic databases, we might really struggle to find relevant records because they just are not using related terms. And so for all of these, I've sort of come up with some ways of dealing with them that we'll go through in a couple of slide time. But taking a brief pause to think about naming the review, I often get called the systematic review police because I do spend some time critiquing constructively methodologies used in systematic reviews. And what is really important is it's not that you can't use the word systematic review, it's that it hides a lot of nuance. So there are so many diverse forms of systematic review. A lot of people are aware of the term and that it adds a bit more weight than just a literature review, but they're not aligning with established methodology. And so what is really important is being transparent and clear about the methods that you use. And if you've deviated from any common gold standard methodology, then justifying and explaining it. So the core principles here really are being really clear about the scope and the intention of your review, having all of the decisions around your methodology planned in advance in the protocol. Any deviations from that protocol are documented and justified really transparently. And any of the methods that you choose that might have limitations associated with them are discussed clearly in your report as well. So if you're doing all those four things, it really doesn't matter what you call it. The problems that we have are where people say they did a systematic review and then depart from methodology, don't report very well. That's where the problems come in. But some of the core criticisms of non-standard approaches that I've seen and that I sometimes have of reviews that are not clear about what they've done or why are a mission creep. So often people start out wanting to do a standard systematic review and then find out, for one of the reasons that we've discussed, either actually their objective changes or they have resource constraints or they underestimated the size of the evidence base, or something happens and what they find is not what they expected, and that's fine. But without planning carefully in advance, it is really easy for the mission to creep. We often see that there is a lack of comprehensiveness, and that's a criticism of some standard reviews as well. That often happens because there's a lack of understanding about the need for grey literature or the need for multiple databases. And so that is a criticism unless you justify it because it makes sense. There's also a risk that systematic bias can slip in. That's why we have systematic review methodology to try and limit the risk of bias. And that often happens because people aren't really aware of the impacts of what happens when you cut corners. And this is what does happen with rapid approaches, um, like rapid reviews, rapid evidence assessments often. And in general, if there's a lack of transparency, that means the review is not repeatable, it's not verifiable, your audience may not trust what you've done. So these are valid criticisms of non-standard approaches and systematic reviews, but they're very easy to account for if you have an a priori protocol and plan carefully. If you do aim to be comprehensive, and if you're not aiming to be comprehensive because you don't need to, be very clear about why that's acceptable, and justify it. Um, be very transparent about the limitations of any methods that you modify, and be as transparent as possible. If you can do all of that, then kind of the world's your oyster in terms of adapting methodology to fit your needs. If you're doing it in a way that's sensible and you're clear about what you've done, how you've done it, and what the impact of those methodological choices are, that's the exciting part of evidence synthesis for me, because you can really start to shift things around and adapt what you're doing. So some of these approaches that I've seen used or I've used, some of them are sort of a bit obvious, a bit entry level, but I really think it's worth mentioning again because in some fields people feel very constrained by that traditional standard systematic review methodology. So one thing that I use pretty much routinely now is a map first approach, where often, I think I mentioned this in the framing seminar I gave, that often people do come with broader questions, and actually it does make sense often to map first, because then you're not risking doing a systematic review and not finding anything. But this is particularly useful for large evidence bases. And so we did this in a systematic map of the impacts of agricultural management on soil organic carbon. And we found 735 studies. This was 10 years ago now, so that's actually not that big for a systematic map. And although there was a desire to do a systematic review, the question that ended up being adopted by the advisory board and chosen and run with was so broad that a map was the only sensible option, really. But what it did mean is that following on from our systematic map, we were able to do 4 systematic reviews. And one of these is still underway, having been updated several times. But this first one was able to be conducted in 6 months, really quite rapidly, because the map had been done first. So this is a scenario where actually the standard approach didn't really make sense, and it allowed us to then break it up into several different component systematic reviews. It's worth mentioning, though, that one of these was not reductionist, despite being a subset of the map. So it wasn't like we separated it up into components that were a simplification. This one in the bottom right was just looking at time series where they had combined lots of interventions together. So we used a specific methodology to look at a subset of the evidence base where complexity was the core area of interest. So just because you map first doesn't mean you're then going to be very reductionist in a way that you target different components. The other approach that I mentioned is a sort of mapping plus, where you're trying to generate a framework as well as just saying, what does the evidence base look like? You actually want to do something with it. So rather than saying there were 10 studies in this country that looked at that and 15 studies in this country that looked at that, you can do something with the way that the articles describe a certain concept. So it could be that you generate new understanding of a concept, or you create a new definition. You could be developing a new conceptual model to understand a system, perhaps by combining lots of conceptual models together. You could also be using the outputs of a systematic map to then parameterize models, so that rather than using single estimate parameters in a model, you're using a very reliable summary of a particular variable. It's not to say it's the study findings, that would be a meta-analysis, but you could use that average content of sand in a particular type of soil, for example, which would be quite easy to extract from studies and average in a meaningful way that wouldn't be a poor meta-analysis. And so I have mentioned this before, but this is one example where we did a map of research articles that had mentioned the word ecotechnology. We extracted all of their definitions, and we then created a framework to understand the core concepts of the definition as it was used, because in general it was never really defined. So we created a definition, and this was quite a neat, quick project. The other type of adaptive approaches are where it's appropriate to randomly or purposively sample the evidence base. So this might be because you're interested in a long list of what the main barriers and facilitators are to a particular intervention, or it might be that you want a long list of interventions or outcomes that have been used to test different interventions. And what is key here is that you don't need to read the entire evidence base to get a good picture of what the barriers and facilitators are. For example, you will reach information saturation. And this is what this figure of minimal returns shows on the right, that at some point you will have identified all of the diversity within your evidence base. So if you're interested in diversity, what are the barriers and facilitators? What are the main barriers and facilitators? You don't need to get every single one. You can get a list of what the main ones are. And this is really particularly the case where you're interested in the diversity within the evidence base. And so this is one project where we've done that. We were interested in what the barriers and facilitators were across the development pipeline, from research and development to integrating into use in farming practice. And so we wanted to look at each of these stages what the main barriers and facilitators were. So we had a very large set of search results. We took a random sample of those titles and abstracts and screened just 10% of them. We also basically coded them at the level at which, along this pipeline, they were talking about. We then, of those randomly sampled search results, we purposively selected a total of 65 to represent all of the main stages of the development pipeline. So we had some records from each of those steps. And that allowed us to, both for grey literature and academic literature, look at, across all of those pathway stages, what the main themes of barriers and facilitators were, and how commonly articles had mentioned them. And because we'd taken a random sample, we were pretty sure that there was limited reason to suspect that within any of those there would be a systematic bias. And it then allowed us to map out how those barriers and facilitators were different, both in their level of attention and distribution across the world. And we had heat maps with other concepts apart from geography as well. So this is where we didn't read all of the evidence base, but we're still pretty sure we've got a representative picture of the main barriers and facilitators that can then be used in policymaking. So the extra effort, the extra cost of screening those additional 90% at title and abstract and then at full text would not perhaps have given us much more information. We felt that we had reached information saturation. And actually you can test for information saturation in these contexts as well by tracking how many new themes you're identifying as you go randomly through the set that you're looking at. And you may start to reach an asymptote. And the next set of, or the final set of adaptive approaches around that final example I gave that I really hate, around diffuse concepts or nebulous topics. And perhaps as a result, where the primary way of searching for evidence in a systematic review, which is searching bibliographic databases, might not be suitable as the primary source of information. Obviously, we know that we search in other ways for grey literature and sometimes hand searching, often citation chasing. But primarily, bibliographic databases are seen as the main first source of information. Um, so this first example that I wanted to give is a review where we were looking at evidence of anticipatory forest use. So this is where a government announces that a protected area is about to be established, and in the time between the announcement and the actual policing of that protected area, there's a common practice of land grabbing around the edges of the park to secure private land before the park is actually policed. And it's a concept that is quite frequently seen, particularly where protected area policing is not great and where the environment is quite pristine and not particularly well developed. But it's not referred to by different researchers in the same way at all. It's a concept that just isn't really described, or it's a concept that's described at length, but not with a particular label. And so what we did here was, I guess, something that's a little bit akin to a realist review, but we a priori set out to do an alternating set of searching for studies that we thought would be relevant, screening them, and then doing citation chasing on them, then analyzing the texts of the search results to look for patterns and new words that might help, or new concepts, but also reading them by hand, and then developing a novel search in addition that we would then deduplicate against our previous search and citation chasing, and then citation chasing from that. So a sort of sequential bouncing between using citation networks and bibliographic searching. And so for that, we could relax our reliance on the first primary search of bibliographic databases, which was quite focused, but we suspected had missed quite a lot of evidence. The other example of this kind of adaptive approach is one I've given before, I think, but where we were looking at the impacts of metal mining in the Arctic. And we planned a systematic map of environmental and social impact assessments. And this was evidence that was documented in a similar way to academic literature, but in a completely different domain. And we were interested in what the predicted impacts might be by this body of researchers. And so we just adapted systematic mapping methodology to deal with a different type of document and a whole different way of searching, where actually physically going to libraries or some of these consultancy firms was needed to obtain those documents. And so throughout all of these, really the emphasis is on matching the methods to the purpose while maintaining defensibility in your methodology. So selecting what aspects of systematic review methodology are important for that context and deciding from, is comprehensiveness really vital, or could we be representative here? Those kind of approaches to really justify where you're cutting corners. And I guess some people might refer to this as a bit of a rapid review in some respects, but it's more than just the speed at which you do the methodology. It's the type of outcome that you want from your project, the type of answer that you're giving to the type of question that you're asking, and being aware that not everything needs to be a quantitative synthesis or a meta-analysis at the end of the day. And then the final concept I wanted to talk about is what happens with a review when you've got particular constraints around time, staff, or resources. And in my experience in the projects I've been involved in, most time is lost in a review project because of mistiming. I'm not quite sure if that's how you spell mistiming. Now reading it, it looks like I've written mistiming. But mistiming screening, so having more than you thought you would get and underestimating how long it would take is really common and really understandable. Also, underestimating the time needed for data extraction and critical appraisal, particularly if your team hasn't done critical appraisal on those study types before. Um, and that is when a lot of umming and ahhing and like, are we doing the right thing and having doubts creeps in, which can waste a lot of time as well. And some of the solutions are um, this map first approach where you don't need to know what you're going to have to do for critical appraisal just yet if you do a map first, because you'll have lots of different study designs. Um, but also really spending time piloting data extraction and critical appraisal. Um, Also, including experienced methodologists really helps. There's a drastic difference between the time constraints, the time used, and the sort of length of time of a project for people without an experienced methodologist versus someone who's done this before and is able to take a leading methodology role. But then this comes to the last thing I wanted to suggest, which is stepwise screening and coding. I'll explain what that means in the next slide, but this is my way of really reducing risk in a review project. And it's probably pretty obvious. Some of you might be doing it anyway, but I often speak to people who haven't thought about it, so I thought it's worth mentioning. And this is to ensure finishability. Um, we can probably all tell what this is, right? Um, it is a picture of the Mona Lisa. And so if you're interested in what the scope of your evidence base looks like, what the nature of your evidence base is, what people have studied, what systems, what metrics, what outcomes, what does the evidence base look like? A low resolution picture, perhaps not this low resolution, but a low resolution picture can tell us everything we need to know. This is really only suitable for mapping or map first projects. It's not going to be appropriate if you want to do a meta-analysis, then you need the resolution because that's where meta-analysis is useful. It has power, it needs precision, it needs accuracy, and doing this won't work. But if you're interested in the nature of an evidence base, then it could. Um, and that's that even low resolution evidence maps can be really useful for identifying research gaps and clusters and giving a representative picture of what's going on. So the way that we do this is that we conduct a full search as normal. We might get lots of results, several tens of thousands, maybe even more. But we then randomize those results and split them into chunks of 10 to 20%. And we then screen those chunks that have been randomly isolated one by one. Typically, we've been doing that at title and abstract and then full text before moving on to the next block. But we've also recently started doing title, abstract, full text, and then data extraction or data coding before moving on to the next one. And you then move on to the next block, and then you do it, and then the next block, and you do it um, as as far as you can until you run out of resources and time. And what that means is that you will have an output, even if someone cuts your funding, you will have 30%, 40% of the evidence base that will give you a representative picture of what's been done where and how. It also means if you have staff leaving unexpectedly or some other problem that means you're slower than you thought you would have a result. And we found that policymakers are pretty happy with this, actually. They think they're getting something for their money. They even down as far as 10% people have been quite happy if the results are a large number of studies. If you do 10% and only have 4 studies, then maybe people won't be happy. But it's particularly useful for broader topics. And one of the additional benefits I've seen is that actually the first block that you do really informs your efficiency in the resulting blocks. If you do all of your title and abstract screening before going on to full text screening, sometimes you are overcautious and you very quickly realize actually that concept wasn't what I thought it was, and I've included too many full text. So you do see the efficiency and the inclusion rate refining as the blocks go on. And so this is a project we're doing this with at the moment, where we're looking at the impacts of blue food consumption in Europe, which is a big area that policy is pushing. And the funder wanted to know what research has been done on the impacts of blue food on social and biodiversity systems. So we actually had a relatively modest set of search results, but we blocked this up into chunks of 20%. And we screened them block by block at title and abstract, then at full text, then at data coding before moving on to the next block. We've already got a pretty good picture of the evidence base after the first block. We'll end up with about 300 studies after 60%, which is the point that we've got to so far. And we will then write that up as a report with the intention of moving on to do the additional 40% to look at the entire evidence base. But that does not necessarily have a value beyond what we can find at 60%. And if we use executable code to produce our visualizations in R, for example, then all we have to do is push a button and the bigger evidence base, the bigger database file gets pumped into the code and then outputted into a file that can just be immediately updated as we do more. And there is, as I said before, this isn't feasible if you're doing a meta-analysis because there will be studies in the blocks that you haven't read that would be important for a meta-analysis. But it is possible to then take the 60% that you've done as an indication of what's in the remainder and focus down and do a sub-search of the ones you haven't screened, that 40%, doing an additional search with another substring for a particular concept that you might be interested in for meta-analysis, and then just screen that small sub-search from the 40% you haven't screened so far. So it will require a bit more work, but there are ways that you can take that forwards without having to start from scratch if you're interested in meta-analysis. This is just an indication of what the database looks like from day one, which already was starting to give us a really nice picture of what the evidence base looked like. So just to summarize, really, we've talked about what standard reviews are and that they're great if your field and subject allows, but that in other fields, excuse me, in particular, the broad questions and diversity of interest and type of evidence mean that we need to be a bit adaptive. Again, learning from gold standard systematic review methodology allows us to know where we can adapt the methodology and what the implications are for that. But any deviations from gold standard methodology or from our plans a priori should be really clearly justified. So, for example, where representativeness was deemed to be acceptable as a replacement for comprehensiveness in terms of reading all of the evidence base. Still need to think really carefully about the risk of bias. That's the core thing that needs to be maintained. And we talked at the end about adaptive approaches that might be a really useful tool as a risk management, project management tool. So if you're not sure how much resources you have or when your review is going to end, doing it in blocks can be a really helpful way of having a point where you say, okay, we're finishing, but we have something, rather than we've got all of the abstracts done, but none of the full text. Yeah, so that's it, really.
Thanks again, Neil. As always, very enlightening and really appreciated it. We'll give some folks some time to put questions into the chat, but I've been writing some down as they've come to me in the meantime. Perhaps a larger one to start, but what role do you think stakeholders like funders and users of evidence, communities impacted by the evidence, have in helping, or perhaps should have in helping, define the methodology for non-standard review? For example, you mentioned policymakers are usually okay with the stepwise process. Even in your case, you showed we're going to do a report at 60, assuming we go on to 80 and 100%. Was that communicated with them beforehand? Did they know that was kind of the process that y'all would follow from the get-go? What's that communication look like beforehand? And again, for even the other types of stakeholders, what level of involvement should they have in how a non-standard review is conducted?
That's a really good question. I think particularly if you're using any kind of non-standard methodology with a stakeholder who kind of knows what systematic reviews are, it's really important to get an a priori, an in advance approval for any deviation like that, or to suggest this when things start to go wrong as a hey, we didn't expect these problems, but here's a solution that can give us an answer without compromising on quality. So it is really key to have that discussion in advance. What we found in general is stakeholders are funders are more interested in confidence in us that we know what we're doing and that we can transparently justify and back up what we've done. Um, so it really helps saying, this is a really big evidence base. So actually, we're going to take the stepwise approach. We're going to try to get to 100, but we think we'll get a representative picture, and this is why just after 40. And the stakeholders we've dealt with have been really appreciative of that honesty. I think the tricky one is this a little learning is a dangerous thing, where people know about a bit about systematic review methodology, and so they ask for one, but they're not realistic about the time constraints. Um, and that is a bit of a problem because they might particularly push you down the standard systematic review route. Um, but I mean, Ruth Stewart says that it's not gold standard evidence if it isn't delivered on time, right? So I do think for commissioners of systematic reviews, they are more accepting of adaptive approaches, um, as long as they know that that's really going to help reduce risk and get them an answer um, in time, really. Um, so I think it depends on how much the stakeholder knows. Um, but if you can be confident and accurate in your suggestion of these methods, I think that helps to allay some fears.
Related question, and then I'll go to the ones in the chat. The search citation chasing, text analysis, search citation chasing kind of workflow that you spoke through, that makes a lot of sense to me intuitively, right? Like if I were trying to do something, that's probably the conclusion that I would come to, even just organically along the way. That's kind of just the process. Um, but when in your process was that decided? Like, did you know from the get-go again that this was what you were going to do? Was that communicated to the folk who would actually be consuming the review itself? Or was it kind of again organically, we started, we realized this wasn't enough, but it occurred to us, hey, we can start pulling on these strings, expand our search and kind of go that way.
Yeah, I mean that is a good question. We knew for this one that it was a diffuse construct right from the beginning. It's one of the things that comes out from the training that I do when we're doing question formulation really early on. If someone's using a diffuse construct, normally they don't know they are until you actually get them to put down a definition. So question formulation really helps. But things like ecosystem services, nature-based solutions, climate adaptation, um, people don't realize they're diffuse constructs until they start actually looking for them, particularly where they're quite novel and they've come about retroactively to describe an evidence base that was around for a while. That's where the problem is, because if you don't call something climate adaptation, but it clearly is, it would be relevant even before that field of research had really been established. So I think as a methodologist, we're in a good position to challenge the people coming up with the reviews around their definitions, which we should be doing anyway. And that's where the diffuse constructs really come out. Um, it's unusual for that to happen after the search has been developed and tested, because you would already start to notice, ideally, you'd start to notice the benchmark list not returning relevant records. Um, so yeah, we knew pretty early on because of that process of like, what do you mean by that um, in the question formulation? So that again is one of the benefits of doing really rigorous question formulation with someone who's not a subject expert and doesn't have the assumptions around diffuse concepts, but also I think having a benchmark list, which is gold standard, but actually not very frequently done. There was a paper that came out recently. Sarah, it might even have been you. Yeah. That a really brilliant paper came out looking at how frequently benchmarking was done, and it's not done very frequently in a lot of gold standard systematic reviews. Um, so that is something that helps identify these problems for sure.
I really want to ask you then, how did you document and talk about your process? Because obviously the issue isn't non-standard methods, it's being transparent about the non-standard methods. But in deference to time, I'll go to the questions not thought of by me. Cecilia asks, can you talk more about how realist reviews compare with these other non-standard reviews?
Um, in short, not really, because realist reviews is something that's not really embraced by any of the review coordinating bodies. They've been around for a long time, but sort of a bit nebulous by definition in the way that they're defined. So I'm definitely not an expert and may mischaracterize them. But my understanding is that they are less focused on establishing strict, rigid methodology in advance and tend to go through a process somewhat similar to what I describe of searching, um, describing the evidence base, going back to the beginning, searching again. So the review itself is a bit of a learning and exploratory process. They're more exploratory searching than they are systematic searching, but they are generally used to understand theories or concepts or how a system functions. So they're very, very, very configurative and not really interested in aggregatives. So for lots of realist reviews, comprehensiveness doesn't really matter in the same way, or it doesn't at certain stages of that exploratory learning process. Um, but I may be mischaracterizing them.
Sounds like it could be a talk on its own. And then
Not by
Megan
me.
asks, which tools or what tools do you use for these adaptive processes? I usually use Covidence, but it's not necessarily built for things like stepwise process.
Yeah, some of them work really well. So the key thing for these tools is that they can cope with you adding in more references as you go in chunks, and you can then identify which of the records in the final set came from where. So from a systems architecture perspective, it you need to be able as a user to filter by upload source by the file that you uploaded, batch one, batch two, and you need to be able to label your articles um, in a way that you can label their inclusion or exclusion in addition to filtering by source. Some of them will let you filter by source, but not also filter by inclusion or exclusion. That's a pretty low baseline, so I imagine lots of tools will. But Sysrev does, TJ putting his hand up. I think it's a pretty low bar, but some of them, if it's not been designed that way, just may not have thought of it. So yeah. And one of the other nice things about Sysrev, it is built for data extraction. So if you want to do that screening and data extraction in rapid succession, then a tool that will allow you to do that before moving back to screening in the tool itself would be really nice.
Full disclosure, I promise we did not ask for that question to be asked. Um, as the evidence base just continues to grow and grow, what standards of methods should we be reconsidering? What methods do you think will just organically need to change? As even when we try to be focused with our question, the number of articles that will be eligible just continues to grow.
Yeah, that's a good concern. And I mean, with the increasing use of AI as well in different stages, that maintaining the human in the loop at the right stage, particularly where you're deciding what methods to adopt and what not, is really key. So I think that's something that we didn't mention last time, but that is key as a concern about AI, really thinking about which steps need to be human engineered and not the result of a suggestion from a model that's learning from aggregation. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think the key thing really is just to think about what the knowledge need is and how you can answer that transparently. So I think the ability to do standard reviews in a short amount of time will wane as the evidence bases increase. And I think AI has a place for being able to deal with that. But I think we're seeing such a rapid increase in the use of so-called systematic review methodology. What I'd like to see is people really interested in critiquing the methodology used and understanding if it was appropriate or not. But what we tend to see used is if people say they did a systematic review and sort of throw a bit of methodology at the editor, they're quite happy to publish it and let that be labeled a systematic review, even if they've adapted in a very incorrect way. So yeah, it's not really an answer, but it's a very tricky question.
We probably got one more time for, or time for one more question from the audience. So whoever is first to type it there, you win. So is it correct in saying then, Neal, that your expectation is that non-standard reviews will begin to be a larger subset of all reviews than the standard review? If that's not already true today, then that percentage will continue to grow.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just in the field of environment, you see more systematic maps being published than systematic reviews in the field of environment. I think to some degree there might be a bit of pushback when people start to realize that systematic maps are still not actually influencing policy in the same way that systematic reviews can. But I think there might be a divide between the policy need and the type of adaptation that happens in some way. Um,
But I do feel
yeah,
like systematic maps, particularly living systematic maps, they, in my mind, in many times, they're a necessary step, right? Unless you know what exists within the literature, how can you begin to review it? I
yeah,
often think of it as almost like a sort, right? If I'm interested in a particular chemical, well, did it come from an animal study? Did it come from an environmental exposure? Did it come from a human study, right? These types of studies will have different types of data, but until I know what exists, I won't know what further questions to ask of which subsets of articles. Um, so the mapping first strategy just makes a lot of intuitive sense to me.
yeah. I think what I'd like to see is a bridging between bibliometrics and or bibliometric indexing and systematic mapping, so that I mean, Web of Science core collections keywords plus is awful. It's really inaccurate. So if we can use AI to improve the way that articles are indexed, that would mean, searching would be so much easier. And then you may not need to do searching and coding because you put your question in and you've got your subset based on really accurate indexing.